Greeting, stranger. Dawn's first rays are filtering through the cabin windows, and that means we must have survived the night's storms. Our prize is the naval city of Escadar, Absalom's second largest settlement. 12,000 people call it home, and many of them patrol the waters to the harbour day and night from the decks of great warships, all commanded by the Sea Lord Lerifis of House Kethlin. Yet it was not always a bustling port. In fact, for all the hustle and bustle, Escadar was only founded in 4138, which is less than 600 years ago. What's more, the city differs from its spiritual progenitor, Diabel, by having been founded not by anarchic pirates, but rather by the state government. Before this directive, the entirety of the Isle of Erran had been considered the exclusive domain of Eredin himself and his closest religious followers. So, how did one become the other, even before Eredin's death in 4606? Well, that tale is a curious one, and I would like to tell it to you now as our ship makes its way into port. This tour will be structured a little differently from the others, principally because there are very few locations in Escadar that demand a visit. Oh, there are a couple, and rest assured that they will not go unrecognized, but the most compelling aspect of this city is found in its history and its function, rather than in its architectural composition, because the city was erected to be an artificial military town. I therefore entreat you to settle in for an education in the city at the center of the world's younger sibling. The story of Escadar is really the story of the Isle of Erran, which is the second largest of the Starstone Isles after the Isle of Kortos. Like its bigger twin, it was raised from beneath the waves of the inner sea by Eredin the Last Aslanti in the year 1 AR, but it was initially overshadowed and left neglected. Kortos boasted the titular Starstone artifact, the sapling of what would become the Grand Holt, and the foundations of the living god city here in the material plane. In comparison, Erran held nothing. It was a lesser fragment of greater powers. Yet it was precisely this tranquility that attracted Eredin to the smaller island. Because it lay off Kortos' northern coast, it was shielded from Absalom's view by the Kortos Mounts, particularly by Arazlant Mox, its tallest peak. The droves of faithful and curious settlers would never even think to explore the rest of the isles when such wondrous things lured them south, and indeed descendants of this doctrine still define the culture of the city-state today. Much of Kortos is still undocumented, let alone the rest of the isles. Erran, then, Eredin tended to in the years following Absalom's founding, decreeing that this island would be a private sanctuary for himself and his most significant devotees. Specifically, he prohibited anyone from venturing into its northern half, leaving it unexplored, undeveloped, and unknown to any who did not enjoy personal friendship with the deity. If the Starstone Cathedral was Eredin's manor, then the Isle of Erran was its domain. The southern half of the island was similarly restricted for many years, until he was persuaded by his followers to permit the establishment of a monastery at its most accessible southern harbour. This became the monastery of St. Sarnax, who was one of the Church of Eredin's most prominent early figures, but whose exploits and achievements have been lost to the obfuscating mists of time everywhere save the dusty law books of the dead god's libraries. For hundreds of years this arrangement continued, and it seems to have been mutually beneficial. To the clergy, it must have felt as though they were occupying a heaven on Golarion, and were permitted at times to walk alongside their god through its gardens. Yet Eredin himself took the opportunity to accumulate secret lore pertinent to his own church within the walls of his monastery, instead of within those of Absalom. It would be difficult for me to overstate the significance of this decision. You may recall from my tour of the Wise Quarter that the founding laws of the city at the center of the world, carved by Eredin's own hand, required all texts brought within Absalom to be relinquished to the scribes of the Forai Logos for reproduction. The purpose of this was explicitly to preserve all knowledge, be it humble or world-changing. Therefore, the decision to reserve certain documents to the clergy on the Isle of Erran seems to have been taken to bypass his own laws. Eredin's detractors often used this to cry hypocrisy, but his followers maintained that secrecy has always been a necessary companion to wisdom. In any case, we still do not know what information is contained within these uncopied scrolls, the undocumented documents as some name them, or what prophecies may be kept hidden from us. Some even believe that they might contradict or replace the Starfall doctrine, which failed to foresee Eredin's death 120 years ago. Naturally, over the years a few people have tried to infiltrate St. Sarnax's Monastery to seize these texts for themselves, or at least to steal a glance at their contents. Unfortunately for them, the god of prophecy seems to have foreseen this, because he ensured that more than monks would call the resplendent and imperishable marble walls their home. In fact, the primary inhabitants of the monastery, even today, remain members of a military order called the Knights of the Aeon Star. These sword mages trace their origins all the way back to ancient Aslant before it was destroyed in the Earthfall cataclysm. They claim to have been servants of that empire's imperial throne. Left leaderless and ruined by the doom that befell Galarian, the survivors eventually reorganized and sought new masters. One sect, called the Knights of the Western Star, whose purpose originally it was to defend the Empire from within, concluded that Eredin was truly the last Aslanti, and devoted themselves to his service. They must have felt vindicated when he later ascended into godhood. The other sect, called the Knights of the Eastern Star, whose adherents in better days had ventured forth beyond Aslant's borders in search of hidden lore, did not recognize this claim, and instead scattered across the world to chase their own heroes. Today, the two sects operate completely independently of one another, and therefore neither acknowledges a division in its order any longer. Consequently, both groups call themselves the Knights of the Aeon Star, but the Magi who still dwell on the Isle of Erran are really the final remnants of its Western sect, and will soon collapse completely into history. My understanding is that only 3 elderly knights remain, dutifully protecting their dead god's secrets for as long as they continue to draw breath. I would caution you strongly against viewing this rather pitiful situation as something that you could easily exploit. You should always be wary of the elderly in professions that claim many youthful lives, and the Knights of the Aeon Star are masters of their trade. Better Magi you will not find anywhere else in Aveston or Gorund, save perhaps Apara in Taldor, where the most prominent chapter of the Knights of the Eastern Star makes its headquarters. All this to say, the day may come when the last of Eredin's defenders in the Isles departs for Pharasma's Boneyard, and that day may even be soon, but it has not yet come to pass, and thus the last Aslanti's secrets will remain furtive. Eredin departed the Starstone Isles around the year 400, and so for millennia the Isle of Erran was left entirely in the hands of the warriors and clergy of the monastery. However, as time marched ever onwards, it became increasingly clear to the Grand Council in Absalom that they could no longer afford the luxury of leaving their northern coastlines unguarded. The pirate siege we discussed during the tour of Diabel was just the first of numerous examples of its authority being challenged, and each appeared more taxing than the last. These attritions apexed during a war with Cheliax in 4137 over control of inner-sea trade routes and shipping lanes. Absalom's navy proved insufficient to defend its own coastlines, and a humiliating defeat allowed the Chalish prince Haliard I to besiege the city. The siege ended in a tactical victory for Absalom, whose first guard repelled the assailants without too much difficulty. However, it quickly became clear that the whole ordeal had been something of a distraction, as it had allowed the Chalish navy to seize control of the Arch of Eredin that commands access to the inner sea, resulting in a strategic victory for the Empire. The following year, Absalom's Grand Council overwrote almost 4,000 years of policy by ordering the construction of a naval base and accompanying town on the Isle of Erran, next to the monastery. The skeleton of Escadar had been completed by the end of that year, so aggrieved was the council. I hope this makes it clear to you how artificial Escadar is, insofar as any settlement can be considered so. The streets and districts were carefully considered and approved long before the first stone was laid. The spacing between amenities and houses was ruthlessly calculated ahead of time by city planners. Its population is indeed worthy of a large city's, but many of its residents are sailors, marines, or their officers, and would call somewhere else home were you to ask them. To that end, the true residents of Escadar, in my opinion, are the Azaketi. The amphibious humanoids have appeared in my tours of both the Docks and Eastgate districts, but Escadar is their true home within these fair isles. Of course, being aquatic humanoids, the Azaketi loathe to live above the waterline, and few actually roam the streets unless summoned to do so. Even among these, they almost always reside in the House of the Cresting Wave, also known as the Wet House or the Embassy of the Gilman. Constructed faithfully in the style of ancient Aslant to underline the shared heritage between the Absalomians and the Azaketi, the Wet House contains just as many passages of flooded tunnels as it does dry corridors. The chambers inside are used as meeting places and offices for representatives of the two communities to meet and conduct diplomacy. The Grand Council, through the Sea Lord and the Navy, pays a small fortune to the Azaketi ambassadors to oversee the conscription and training of hippocampi, which resemble and largely function as horses of the sea. A trained hippocampus pulling a seaborne chariot or sledge commanded by a warrior is worth its weight in gold, as proven time and time again by the skill and cunning of the Wave Riders, an elite, independent branch of Absalom's navy. The Wet House contains great indoor pools connected by hidden rivers to the inner sea that tame and train these creatures for battle. Beyond the House of the Cresting Wave, it is said that Escadar contains more bars, gambling dens, and brothels per capita than any other port, and I do believe that might just be true. It is one of the few cities that seems to sleep during the day and stir after sunset, when every second building throws open its doors to welcome off-duty sailors and officials. There are clusters of residential streets and wards, and even families to occupy them, but they are vastly outnumbered by the businesses that cater to ship crews, and indeed to the ships themselves. Remember that Escadar is not just any port, it is the home of the Absalomian Navy, one of the finest in the world. The marina is choked at all hours with cogs and brigs and great galleons of war, and only a few piers are accessible by merchant vessels and travellers. The forests that once hemmed St. Sarnax's Monastery against the coast are constantly being felled by platoons of lumberjacks sent forth from their ships to fetch fresh timber, and the entire island would have long since been deforested were it not for the sustaining power of the fifth and final Aeon Tower, called the Erran Tower, located northeast of the city limits. The city is governed by a handful of appointed officials who convene as the Lesser Council, a shadow of the Grand Council that rules the city at the center of the world. Its members almost exclusively come from naval careers or from the nepotistic lineages of Absalom's great families, who often arrange to offer a young politician a safe taste of the high life within Escadar's walls. As you might expect from such an arbitrarily chosen committee, the streets of Escadar are infamous for their disappearances and murders. Their numerous parlours and dens are called sin lodges, and they frequently let their sins spill out into the open air. It is not quite as dangerous as a district like the Puddles, or as scandalous and nefarious as the Coins. It is rather better to think of the crime in Escadar as dockside brawls and tussles enlarged to envelop the whole city. In fact, the Lesser Council maintains an arrangement with most of these pits that their iniquities will be tolerated, so long as they agree to pay heavy taxes and to submit to no-notice inspections. Many observers, myself included, see this arrangement as little more than formalized bribery and sanctioned rapid response cleanup crews, but after 12 tours of the city of the center of the world's districts, one learns to choose one's battles very carefully. On the other hand, if you were ever to decide to gather a group of sea-spirited companions and strike out on your own as a sanctioned privateer, Escadar would undoubtedly be the best place for you to begin. Not only are its residents almost all experienced sailors, but the Lesser Council has been known to issue letters of marque to suitably enthusiastic crews. The Absalonian Navy is well equipped and well trained, but it is a lot smaller than many of its rivals, and so its captains are always willing to endorse those brave or foolish enough to patrol its waters on their behalf. I should finish, I think, by telling you of the rest of the island. Once you leave behind the port city and its ancient monastery, Erran becomes an anarchic, untouched wilderness. The Aeon Tower has fostered enormous growth, and the Church of Erran retains enough influence within Absalonian politics to keep these verdant acres more or less unmolested. The only other settlement on the island, the odd hermit lair notwithstanding, is Aberton on its eastern shore, which is a tiny community of farmers and ranchers who broke away from Escadar's influence many generations ago. Run by the Aber family, Aberton may not survive into the next generation if its labourers continue to choose emigration to greener pastures elsewhere. Of course, the Aber family likes it that way. Tiny, isolated, quiet. Otherwise, the Isle of Erran is populated only by the ancient gravesites of Arodenite clergy. Graves and tombs are rumoured to riddle the landscape north of the Erran Tower, and it is not uncommon to hear stories of treasure hunters meeting grisly fates in them. Occasionally, the Pathfinder Society will seek permission from the Grand Council and the Church of Erran to send expeditions to the most promising, seeking lore or fortune. But for the most part, the landscape remains untouched by history. Perhaps it is a remnant of Eridan's magic that it seems still to be left alone, or perhaps it is simply the final bastion of an increasingly scarred world. Only time will tell. Well, stranger, there we have Escadar. We should be making port in mere moments. My advice would be to stroll through the streets while they are protected by daylight, and to pay a visit to the House of the Cresting Wave, and to the monastery in the centre of town. You will not be able to miss either. They are by far the most imposing and well-maintained structures in the city. Come dusk and the Legion of Marinas, I suggest you seek me in the closest tavern to our pier. I must decide where to tour next, and it is a decision I ought not to take without first consulting my fellow travellers. To the northwest lies Andoran, to the northeast, Taldor. To the southeast lies Kadira, a distinguished province of the Padishah Empire of Kalesh, while finally to the southwest lies ancient Assyrian. Each boasts history, culture, and gateways to even farther kingdoms. Yet we can only travel in one direction at a time. Absalom was only ever the first nation of a world brimming with lore. So, enjoy your stay in Escadar, and then come find me again. Well, until then.